Hello, I'm Jeff Hoffman of ACT Network Solutions. Welcome to our webinar. Today's topic is Business Data Protection Basics. Our goal today is to give you the background necessary to create an effective data protection strategy for your business. Whether you recognize it or not, the data that supports your business is probably its most valuable asset. Most businesses can't live for very long without their data, so call this a business survival guide. Now let's talk a little bit about what actually is a data disaster. A data disaster is anything that threatens the viability of the information that's stored in your business that might keep you from being able to keep your business running in the long term or even in the short term. Now let's give it a little definition here. What is a data disaster? Obviously, it's a natural disaster: flood, tornado, hurricane. The recent disaster in Joplin, Missouri, is a prime example of a natural disaster that just wiped out a town and all the businesses inside of it. But it could also be a fire or a power surge that knocks out all the electronics in your building, or any other physical damage that jeopardizes your facility. It might be a server failure or a hard drive failure within that server. When a hard drive fails, it's very, very difficult to get the data that's on it recovered effectively. Or it could be hacking, somebody outside getting into your network and destroying things, or employee tampering and vandalism. Those also can be a data disaster. Or it could be something as simple as an employee error. Somebody wasn't paying attention and accidentally deleted a file, a key folder, or maybe a database. Now, the data protection industry is awash in statistics, and there are some pretty important ones that you should be aware of. For example, barely a third of all small to mid-sized businesses have a disaster recovery plan in place. And of those that don't, which is 2/3 of today's businesses, only 10% of them will survive a true data disaster. Now, it may not be from the outside that you suffer a data disaster, because 70% of all successful attacks on computer networks were carried out as an inside job, either by a contractor in your business temporarily or an employee, maybe a disgruntled employee that wants to get back at the company and decides to start deleting things on the network. Also, you've got to be aware that 140,000 hard drives crash every week in the United States. And when a hard drive crashes, the odds are the data that was on it won't be recoverable. Now, how do you prepare for those kind of events? Well, when you build a complete data protection strategy, there are 4 critical components or steps to follow. Let's go through them briefly. First, you have to inventory all of your data. That means sitting down and going through your business and looking at every aspect of it and all of the data that supports each one of those areas. Now, here's a sample of a typical information inventory for a company. Many of these things are obvious: payroll, accounts receivable, accounts payable, but some of them are less obvious, and very often they're overlooked. Things like email, instant messaging, and texting. This is a growing component of how businesses communicate, and the information stored there can be critical to your operation. You better be prepared to protect that data as well. Now, once you've identified all of your data, you have to group it according to the importance to your business's continuity. In other words, if something went wrong, what do you have to have first to keep your business functioning? Prioritize all of your data. Let me show you some sample groupings. For example, here's a simple company information grouping for a sales company. The items on the far left are the ones that have been deemed most critical to the operation. Order entry, client contact information, shipping and receiving information. The data in the middle is important, but maybe not quite as critical. Accounts receivable, accounts payable might be able to wait a little while. And the things on the far right column are those things that could wait a little bit longer. It's not that they're not important, they're just not as business critical to your continuity. Now, once we've got them grouped, we have to establish what's called the downtime threshold. Each group will have its own threshold. Now, what is the threshold? It's basically finding your company's business pain points. At what point after a loss will your business start to experience serious problems? What are your pain points? How long can your business operate without your data before you start missing deadlines? Production suffers, sales are suffering, or customers start complaining or taking their business elsewhere. Cash flow. How important is cash flow to keeping your business running smoothly? Employee non-productivity. How long can you have your people sitting around doing nothing and still pay them? You have to address all of these things and figure out which one is your primary pain point. Now, once you've done that, you go back to your grouping and say, okay, fine. In this sales company's organization, we figure that we can go for 8 hours before things really start getting dicey for our left column information. In the middle column, well, we can live without that for 3 days. And maybe in this example, they can live for a week without their personnel files or their emails or their sales literature. It's kind of a subjective thing, but you have to have an idea of what you need to keep your business running. Now, once you've established the smallest pain point, that is your downtime threshold. That's the point in time where you've got to have your data back up and running or serious pain starts happening in your company. Now, not all organizations will have the same criteria. For example, let's talk about a senior care center. Now, maybe their immediate need is their patient medication management system. As you would expect, their residents need their medication on time. So they can't afford to be down for very long. So there's a shift in what's important for them. And maybe they determine that they can't go for an hour without their patient management system and the things in the left-hand column. Their downtime threshold might only be an hour. Each organization is different, but once you do this for your organization, you should be able to determine how long you think you can last before you really are going to start paying serious consequences for how long you don't have your data. Now let's talk about the fourth element of the backup protection strategy, and that is how long do you need to hold copies of each grouping of your data, either for compliance purposes or business reference. Compliance is becoming an ever-increasing influence in everybody's business today, and you may have certain rules applied to how long you have to protect your data. This is called versioning, and I can't stress enough that you have to pay attention to how long you're willing to hold your data in a retention policy. Okay, we're going to move forward a little bit into looking at backup alternatives. You've established what you've got to back up, what's most important, how long you can live without it, and how long you have to hold it. Now, there are three basic types of backups. There are certain hybrids and variations, but they broadly fall into three major categories. There's the data-only backup. This is most like the old tape backup systems that people used to use on their servers. Now, tape is essentially a dead technology. The capacities didn't keep up with the size of hard drives, so it kind of died off. But some people are still using it. Data only says I'm going to take my files and my folders and protect them. I'm not going to worry about the operating system. I'm not going to worry about the programs. I can always reload those at a later time. The second type is called a server mirror. Some people call it a bare metal backup. A server mirror takes into account not only your programs and your operating system and your data, but all of the settings and all the licensing so that you can get up and back up and running faster than a data only that will require additional steps in the recovery process. So this is for organizations that have to be up quicker than a traditional data only backup. The top of the food chain in this particular scenario is the server failover system. A failover is not only a server mirror, but it's a server that can take over in place of your failed computer if things go wrong. You throw a couple of electronic switches, the failover server takes the place of the production server, keeps you up and running while you go out and take the time to manually repair your server. Then you can take your failover server image, port it back over onto the new server, switch the failover server back up into mirroring mode, and seamlessly transition to your new server. This is the one for organizations that absolutely can't afford any downtime. Now here I'm going to take a couple of minutes to drill down into each one of these broad backups just to give you a little bit more background on each one. Now again, the data-only backup backs up just your files and your folders. It's a rather simple process. It's pretty inexpensive. Our product is called Data Vault Standard. It's for organizations that can afford to be offline for a little bit of time, but they're more prepared to deal with what we call the oops moments, the accidental deletion of files or folders that can be easily brought back quickly. It's relatively simple to use, it's inexpensive, it's designed for single file or folder recovery. Some versions, like Data Vault, can even do versioning for up to a year to keep your data historically versioned in the need to recover. The downside of the data-only backup is it's not really designed for fast disaster recovery. It backs up only your data, which means if you suffer a full-fledged data disaster, after you've replaced your hardware, you have to reload your operating system, create all new settings for it, then load your programs, and then put your data back. It's a very slow recovery time for disasters, but it's also very economical. Organizations that can live offline without their data for an extended period of time will find this kind of backup very valuable. Now moving up, we come to the server mirroring system. As I said earlier, this creates an exact copy of everything on your server, your programs, your operating system, and all your data. It'll back up everything. It's fast recovery. As soon as you've got your replacement equipment in place, whether it be a hard drive or a whole new server, you can pour your data from your mirror back onto the new device and you're up and running in as little as an hour. It will also restore to dissimilar equipment. Now, not all mirrors will do that, but ours does. Ours is called Shadow Protect Pro, and it will actually let you take the data that was originally mirrored from one server and transport it to a dissimilar device. For example, perhaps you had a Dell server. It's about a 5-year-old server, and they don't make parts for it anymore. Something goes wrong, you've got to go to your computer supplier, and you bring in a Hewlett-Packard ProLiant. A dissimilar piece of equipment, but our software will actually adjust the settings of the operating system to allow for the change in the hardware without having to reload everything from scratch. This is a really nice feature for people who have to get back up and have older equipment where it might be tough to find replacement parts. The nice thing about mirrors is that most of them can actually take snapshots of your server in much smaller increments, as little as 15 minutes, so you can do much more granular recovery if you need to. Data-only backups tend to run once a night, but with this scenario, you can go back an hour, 2 hours. It can be really handy. It does do historical versioning, so you can, again, hold long periods of time in your backup in case you need to go back for something that got misplaced and wasn't discovered immediately. And it still does all of the single file and folder recovery that the previous version does. Now, what's the downside of this? Well, because obviously it's a much more sophisticated process, it is a little more expensive, but if configured correctly and you don't go out and buy it and maybe just use it as a service like we offer it, it can be a very affordable solution. Imaging does take a little longer in real time, but if you time the backups properly, it doesn't really gobble up your bandwidth. So it can do everything with very little impact to the company. Now, how long is your downtime? We have to add the caveat to the fast recovery. It depends on how fast you can get your replacement equipment in place. If it takes you a while to find a replacement hard drive, that's going to drag out the process. I'm sure you understand that. Now let's move up to the failover server, because this one is the best solution for businesses that have to be up and running all the time, every day, night and day. It can take over the functions of a failed server within minutes. We throw a few electronic switches and the server comes up, takes over the process of your failed server. When you've got your physical equipment replaced and you're ready to move back to operation, you just take the mirror, pour the image back to the new device, and put the failover server back into mirror mode, and you're up and running. You can be up in minutes with this kind of a system. Again, just like the other mirror, it does restore to dissimilar equipment if you're caught in that problem. It does the snapshotting just like the mirror does the historical backup versioning, and it still does the single file and folder recovery. So it gives you all the features of the previous versions, but in essence, it's a server so it can take over where some of the other solutions can't in the event of a failure. Now, this is the most, as I said, this is the most comprehensive solution, again, because it is a true server as opposed to a storage device. It is a little bit more expensive, but again, if you take it on as a service as opposed to having to go out and buy all the hardware, it can turn out to be a very affordable solution for you. Again, because it's keeping everything copied, all things on your server. Backup has to be balanced so that it doesn't overwhelm the bandwidth of whatever system you've got, particularly if you've got a very, very active environment with a lot of data changes going on in real time. But all in all, this is the best one for keeping you up and running when you absolutely have to. Now let's take a little time to discuss how you select the right backup method. Remember, we created your downtime threshold, and this is going to dictate which type of backup is best for you. If you've got to be up in under 4 hours, no matter what, you should really consider the failover mirroring server as your backup solution. It's the most reliable at getting you up and running as fast as possible. If you can be down for a little bit of time while your server is being repaired, and then it can get re-imaged, the server mirror would be best for you. It won't take over your operation, but it will get you up and running as fast as you've got a replacement device. Now, if you can be down for over a day or a couple of days, then you can use the data-only backup. But you better be prepared, because when you get your new device in, before you can put your data back on it, you have to reload your operating system, create all new settings for your network, and then you have to load your programs. And when the technicians arrive to do that, you better have those disks and license keys and serial numbers all ready to go, because it'll just drag the process out enormously. Now, there's one other obstacle that you really have to pay attention to, and that is how fast can you recover. The first issue is how fast are you going to get the replacement or repaired equipment back in place. If you can run right over to the local computer store and get the replacement hard drive or get a new server, it's one thing, but if you've got to ship away for it and wait for it to come in, that's going to impact how fast you can start your recovery process. Now, keep in mind, data only is going to take a lot longer because there's a lot more steps. Failover is the fastest because it takes over electronically within seconds. Now, if your data backup is off-site, and it should be, you have to also weigh how fast you can get it back on-site. Consider the amount of time it'll take to retrieve your data from wherever it is stored. Companies like ours will actually bring your mirror server back to you, or your storage device, your mirror, back to you. We'll drop it in the truck and run it over to you. Or if you're out of state, we'll express mail it to you via Federal Express or something like that. Some companies don't offer these services, so you better be aware of the return time, because you won't necessarily have time or the resources to pour all of your data back. You have to do a little math sometimes by looking at the transfer rate of your internet connection and how fast it can pour what could be 50 or 100 gigabytes of data back across that line to your server. We've seen instances where those kind of restore efforts can take days to recover because of the enormity of the amount of data that's got to come back in the event of a full-fledged restoration. Now let's talk about best backup and recovery practices, because this is something that we often see people forget to do. You have to conscientiously follow up on your backup results to make sure they're working if you've taken a service that doesn't provide that for you. A backup service that's called a managed backup service will do that kind of service for you as part of the process. Some of the mass market services that you find on the internet, like Mozy and some of these others, they don't provide it. They rely on you to make sure that your backup worked. Now, I can't stress enough the need to keep your data off-site. We've seen a lot of people that try to keep it in their building, and a fire is going to take out that backup device just as easily as it takes out your primary server. So keep your data off-site in some sort of a secure facility. And of course, without saying, it has to be encrypted. Never send your data out of your possession in an unencrypted format. Now, periodic testing of your recovery process is also critical. You have to make sure it works when it gets to crunch time. Make sure you've got historical versions of your data, because it'll improve your recovery process in case you don't necessarily understand immediately that something has gone missing. We've had people come to us and say, get me something from last month. We even had one company that wanted us to go back 11 months because they didn't know when they lost something. And it turned out they lost it 11 months previously and didn't recognize it for all that time. Now, you also have to sit down and annually review your data inventory, your retention policies, and make sure that it's up to date. Business evolves too fast today to rely on something that isn't looked at frequently to make sure it's up to date. And for heaven's sakes, make sure your documentation is good and written and separate from your backup process. There's nothing more traumatic than when somebody goes, where's our backup procedure? And somebody goes, it was kept on the server. And it went with the backup data. So keep a copy of your documentation so that you're ready when the disaster happens. Okay, now let's recap. Planning for a disaster is never simple, but you have to know what you absolutely need to survive. You have to know how long you can survive without it, and plan your backup and recovery strategies around your downtime threshold. If you stay with that in mind, you'll have minimal financial loss when something goes wrong. Understanding the recovery steps if something goes wrong is critical. Don't be standing there after the disaster and going, well, what do we do now? Make sure everything is documented and you're ready when it happens. And verify and test everything. And review your plan to make sure it's always up to date. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about the cloud? Well, the cloud is very important. It is an inevitability that businesses are transitioning to the cloud. But it doesn't absolve you from planning to protect your data. It just requires a different set of questions to be asked during this process. It may change some of your tactics, but it still has to be addressed. Data does not automatically become safe because you kept it in the cloud. Never trust anybody who says, don't worry, it's safe in the cloud. You have to make sure. We'll talk about that more in our next presentation. Surprisingly, it's called Planning for a Data Disaster in the Cloud. Now, thank you very much for sitting through this presentation. I hope you've gathered some important information that you can use. I've posted our contact information on the screen, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. My email address is there. Our phone number is there. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have about anything that maybe I didn't make clear enough. Thanks for sitting with us this afternoon, and you have a good day.